Imagine someone writes this brilliant piece of computer code. I mean, it's elegant, it's flawless, and incredibly powerful.
Right. A perfect tool.
Exactly. But now, imagine someone else takes that exact same code and uses it to shut down a city's power grid in the dead of winter.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a disaster.
It is. And if we trace that resulting chaos back to its source, we have to ask this strangely difficult question. Was the code itself evil? Or is morality purely a symptom of how a tool is applied?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Right, because usually when we discuss human nature, we really don't think in these mechanical terms. We look at history or, we look at the daily news, and we try to stuff humanity into one of two very rigid boxes.
Yeah, the classic binary.
Exactly. We either assume people are inherently good but corrupted by a cruel world, or we assume we are inherently selfish, with society just acting as this thin cage, keeping our darker instincts in check.
And honestly, it is the ultimate philosophical trap. I mean, for thousands of years, theologians and thinkers have forced this binary choice upon us.
Yeah, they really have.
And the problem is, no matter which box you choose, you end up placing this tremendous, unresolvable burden entirely on the shoulders of the individual.
But what if both of those boxes are completely useless? What if the entire framing of human nature as good or evil is just, well, a massive misunderstanding of how the universe actually operates?
That's exactly what we're getting into today.
It is. And welcome to you listening to today's deep dive. Our core mission today is exploring a really fascinating translated text. It's titled Beyond Original Sin, Material Logic and Social Mechanism, written by Feng.
Yeah, and this text really unpacks the concepts of Lifechanyuan, which the author describes essentially as a framework for a new, idealized era of human existence, sort of a spiritual garden for life, you could say.
Yeah, spiritual gardening.
Exactly. It's this sweeping structural deconstruction of human behavior. I mean, the author attempts to explain the root causes of everything from violent historical revolutions to the friction in modern marriages, and ultimately he challenges the very foundation of original sin.
Before we jump into the mechanics of this philosophy, though, I need to make a very clear note for you, the listener.
Oh, right. Absolutely.
Because this text directly critiques some strongly held religious beliefs.
Yeah.
I mean, it specifically analyzes Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Taoism.
And political ideologies, too, right?
Yes, exactly. It dissects major political structures, including Marxism and the Chinese Communist Party. So I just want to be crystal clear. The purpose of this deep dive is absolutely not to endorse or validate or take sides on any of these political or religious viewpoints.
Right. We are remaining completely impartial here.
Completely impartial. Our only goal is to explore the architecture of these ideas exactly as the author presents them, just so you can understand the arguments for yourself.
It's a necessary boundary for this kind of exploration, I think. Our objective is strictly to examine the logic the author uses to connect the dots between human suffering and societal structure.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the author claims that arguing over whether human nature is inherently good or inherently evil is a total waste of time, since both premises are wrong.
Yeah, he just throws the whole debate out the window.
Right. So where does he establish the actual baseline for human consciousness?
Well, he bypasses human morality altogether. He starts at the foundational level of the universe, focusing on a concept he refers to as alaya consciousness.
Alaya consciousness.
Right, and from this perspective, pure consciousness has absolutely no moral alignment. There is no right and there is no wrong.
Wait, really? No right or wrong at all?
None. Consciousness is simply a cosmic recording device. It just captures the data of the material cycle, the activities of life, and the physics of the universe with absolute unfiltered neutrality.
So it's essentially just raw data observation. I mean,
Yeah.
It doesn't judge a hurricane for destroying a forest any more than it judges the sun for growing a tree.
That is the precise baseline, yeah. Morality does not exist in the ether of pure thought. The split between good and evil only occurs when a secondary element is introduced, and the author calls this material logic.
Material logic. Okay, break that down for me.
Sure. So material logic is the process of taking the neutral content of your consciousness and applying it to achieve a specific physical result in the material world.
Let's get into the mechanics of that then. If pure consciousness is just observing neutral data, how does the author define what makes a physical action good or evil once that material logic actually kicks in.
Well, he anchors it to the concept of totality. The idea is that the universe functions as a massive, interconnected, harmonious whole.
Okay, I'm following.
So when a human being applies material logic in a way that creates or sustains or supports the totality of the universe, that action is defined as right and good.
And on the flip side.
Right. When material logic is applied in a way that destroys or disrupts that totality, the action is wrong and evil.
Oh, that brings us right back to the computer analogy from the beginning.
Yes, perfectly.
The ones and zeros sitting on a hard drive are just the alaya consciousness. They're totally neutral data. The morality only manifests based on the material logic of the user.
Exactly.
So if you apply that code to optimize a hospital's life support network, you are supporting totality. But if you deploy it as a virus to crash that same network, you are destroying totality.
That's spot on.
And the author makes a very similar point regarding science, right? The fundamental laws of physics and chemistry aren't inherently malicious.
No, not at all.
You can take the exact same scientific principles and use them to cure diseases, or you can use them to engineer weapons of mass destruction.
What's fascinating here is how this entirely shifts the paradigm of accountability, because the science isn't to blame.
Right.
And the sheer capacity of human consciousness to understand that science isn't to blame either. The morality is entirely dictated by the application.
That perspective certainly removes the feeling that we're all born carrying some innate spiritual darkness.
It does. It really frees the individual in a way.
But, it leaves a rather massive gap in the logic for me.
Oh, how so?
Well, if our consciousness is just this neutral hard drive, and we aren't born with any sort of original sin, then why is the material world so incredibly chaotic?
I see what you mean.
Yeah, because we don't have to look hard to see people inflicting immense pain on each other. Where's all this sin actually coming from?
And this is where we arrive at the author's central thesis. He argues that man is absolutely not born into sin.
Okay.
What humanity categorizes as sin or evil is simply the inevitable friction caused by incomplete, imperfect social operating mechanisms.
Wait, so we're talking about the actual systems we've built to govern our lives?
Precisely.
Yeah.
The structures, the laws, the economic models, the environments we inhabit, all of it.
Wow.
The author's argument is that human suffering over the millennia isn't a symptom of defective souls. It is a symptom of defective engineering.
Defective engineering, that's quite a phrase.
Right. When a social operating mechanism is flawlessly designed, destructive behavior is minimized. But when a mechanism is structurally broken, it essentially forces individuals into a state of extreme competition and conflict.
And then society just conveniently labels that conflict as sin.
Exactly.
To explain how a mechanism forces behavior, the text uses this brilliant, highly relatable scenario.
Oh, the apartment one. Yes, I love this part.
It's so good. So imagine an apartment where 6 people live, but the architect only installed one single toilet.
It just perfectly grounds a very lofty philosophical concept into immediate visceral reality.
It really does. Because you don't need a degree in sociology to predict what happens in that apartment every single morning.
Total chaos.
Absolutely. You have 6 human beings with basic biological needs, and they're all constrained by this severe structural bottleneck. There is going to be intense friction.
Someone takes too long in the shower.
Exactly. Someone is late for work, people are banging on the door, they're harboring deep resentments, maybe even screaming at each other in the hallway. Now, a traditional moralist might look at that screaming match and conclude, well, humans are just naturally hostile, selfish, and sinful.
But the author, however, asks us to look at the plumbing.
Yes.
The inhabitants aren't screaming because their souls are corrupted. They are screaming because the restrictive design of their environment demands aggressive competition just for a basic necessity.
And if you bring in a contractor and install a second toilet, the hostility drops dramatically.
It's like magic.
The screaming stops. The roommates are suddenly polite to each other. And if you install a third toilet, the so-called sin in that apartment effectively ceases to exist.
Because the environment changed.
Right. The people didn't undergo any sort of intense spiritual purification overnight. The environment simply stopped forcing them to fight for survival.
He reinforces this mechanical view with another analogy, the analogy of flies.
Oh, right. The flies.
He asks the reader to consider the origin of flies in a room. If you maintain a pristine, meticulously clean environment, you won't encounter a single fly.
Makes sense.
But if you allow garbage and rotting food to accumulate, the space will quickly swarm with them. The flies do not magically materialize from the void.
Right, they aren't just popping into existence.
Exactly. They are a direct biological response to the environment.
So the environment breeds the outcome.
That is the core mechanism. You cannot blame the physical space for being inherently evil. You have to recognize that an unclean environment mathematically produces a specific result. Behavior is bred by the conditions provided.
I can easily visualize how this works on a micro scale. I mean, roommates fighting over a bathroom is a very clear mechanical failure.
Totally.
But the author doesn't stop at the living room. How does he scale this toilet theory up to explain, centuries of global conflict and massive societal structures?
Well, he applies the exact same logic, just with much, much larger variables.
Like what?
Take the history of political revolution. The text specifically examines the numerous peasant uprisings in Chinese history, including the revolutions led by the Communist Party.
Okay, that's definitely a larger scale.
Right. And the author asks a mechanical question here. Did millions of peasants possess some innate, violent desire to rebel against authority? Was there a sinful, rebellious gene driving them?
I mean, traditional history sometimes paints them as innate troublemakers or, ideological zealots.
But the author rejects that completely. He argues those uprisings were just the unavoidable friction of a terrible social operating mechanism, specifically the unreasonable distribution of the means of production.
So it's the plumbing again.
Exactly. Let's look at the mechanics of that system. When an economic structure allows a tiny fraction of the population to hoard the vast majority of resources while simultaneously leaving the masses to face starvation.
This system itself engineers an explosion.
Yes. The mechanism leaves the population with literally no alternative but to upend the structure to survive. Had the distribution mechanism been reasonable, the revolutions would have lacked the friction necessary to even ignite.
He also uses this framework to explain modern governmental corruption, right? Like comparing countries like Singapore and China.
Yeah. He points out that official corruption is statistically much lower in Singapore than in China. And again, he applies the mechanism test.
Are Chinese officials simply born with more corrupt souls than officials in Singapore?
Then the author argues, no, absolutely not. The disparity is entirely due to flaws in the bureaucratic operating mechanisms. Think about how a system might actually incentivize corruption.
Like having unchecked power.
Right. If oversight is opaque, or if officials have unchecked power over economic choke points, or if their legal compensation doesn't align with their authority, well, the system acts like the garbage in the room.
It actively breeds the flies.
Exactly. A tighter, more transparent mechanism starves the corruption.
And then the author pushes this even further into the most intimate aspects of human life, which I found fascinating. He applies this structural analysis to marriage and the family unit.
Yeah, this is where it gets very personal.
It does, because society generally views issues like intense domestic anger, infidelity, or bigamy as severe moral failings. If someone cheats, it is considered a deep flaw in their character.
Yet the text reframes these painful domestic issues as symptoms of what he calls the survival mechanism of marriage.
The survival mechanism.
Right. The author argues that human beings are not naturally wired for constant domestic warfare. The friction arises because we force human relationships into a highly pressurized, restrictive operating model.
By tying financial survival, property ownership, and emotional fulfillment to a single, rigid household structure, you're basically putting those 6 people back in the apartment with one toilet.
That's a perfect way to put it.
The stakes are so high that any deviation causes massive systemic failure. And he boldly suggests that outside the specific operating mechanism of traditional marriage, a lot of these negative behaviors wouldn't even have the conditions to manifest.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the author is really providing a master diagnosis for the anxiety of the modern world.
Yeah, the anxiety is palpable everywhere.
He points to the alarming depletion of natural resources, the degradation of the environment, and just the constant underlying tension in global societies. And he explicitly ties this to the sheer scale of the human population.
Right, he mentions a global population of 6.8 billion people in the text.
Yeah.
And just to update that for you listening today, we've actually recently crossed the 8 billion mark.
Which is staggering.
It is. But the author's fundamental point only becomes more critical with those extra numbers. So, are all the fierce modern competition, the environmental destruction, and the daily combative stress we all feel, are they just the symptoms of a broken global system?
That is the ultimate conclusion of his scale. We aren't witnessing a sudden global decline in morality.
No.
No, we are witnessing the terrifying friction of 8 billion people trying to share an operating mechanism that just wasn't designed to handle that capacity. The overt and covert conflicts happening day and night, they are literally the groans of an overloaded system.
He even quotes an old saying about the system, forcing young girls of good families to prostitute themselves and forcing boys to join the rebels.
Because the mechanism leaves them no other viable path for survival.
Exactly. But, okay, here is where I struggle with the text a bit, and I want to push back on the author's logic.
Sure, let's hear it.
If absolutely everything is the fault of the mechanism, if the system made me do it, doesn't that completely eradicate the concept of personal responsibility?
It sounds like it, yeah.
Furthermore, earlier in the text, the author explicitly states that humanity's core crisis is a crisis of the soul.
He does lay that foundation, yes.
How is that not a glaring contradiction? I mean, you can't spend pages arguing that man is totally neutral and bad mechanisms cause all sin, but then turn around and claim the real problem is a crisis of the soul. Which one is it?
I completely understand why it appears paradoxical on the surface. However, the author actually anticipates this challenge.
Oh, he does.
He does. And he resolves it by defining the relationship between the soul and the system, not as a contradiction, but as a mandatory symbiosis. It is a strict order of operations.
Okay, so how does that symbiosis actually work in practice?
Well, it begins with the realization that a good social operating mechanism does not build itself. It absolutely requires people with beautiful souls, meaning individuals who possess pure intentions and a desire for totality to design and construct it in the first place.
Right, the architects.
Exactly. If the architects of a system are driven by selfishness, the resulting mechanism will inevitably be flawed and oppressive. Therefore, constructing the beautiful soul is step one. It is the prerequisite for any positive change.
So you need an architect who actually wants to build enough toilets for everyone.
Correct. But here's the crucial second half of that symbiosis. Merely possessing a beautiful soul is grossly insufficient.
Because it's not enough on its own.
Right. Once those individuals exist, they must immediately pivot to the hard, practical work of building a functional mechanism.
Why immediately?
Because if they fail to do so, the harsh, grinding reality of an unmanaged environment will eventually destroy those beautiful souls. Without a system to protect it, a good intention cannot survive the friction of material reality.
The author uses a romantic analogy here that makes this dual requirement incredibly clear. He compares it to people falling in love.
Oh, yeah, it illustrates the point perfectly.
Right, because when a couple first falls in love, everything feels effortless. They both possess these beautiful souls regarding each other. They have pure intentions. They want to support each other, and they naturally want to avoid conflict.
The honeymoon phase.
Exactly. But if they just rely on that initial feeling and fail to build actual operating mechanisms for their shared life, like if they don't establish clear communication protocols, or if they don't figure out a fair system for managing finances, or even a mechanism for dividing household chores, what happens?
The initial purity of the intention begins to erode under the weight of daily logistics.
Yes. The lack of a system breeds resentment. The beautiful soul wasn't enough to survive the friction of sharing a life. Eventually, they either break up or they endure a lifetime of painful, unnecessary conflict. They needed a structure to preserve their original intentions.
This raises an important question regarding our global reality.
I am listening.
If human flourishing requires this delicate, symbiotic balance, the active cultivation of beautiful souls paired with the meticulous construction of flawless social operating mechanisms who, in the author's view, is currently succeeding.
Well, his answer is essentially a sweeping indictment of modern civilization. He argues that absolutely everyone is failing, primarily because our institutions only ever focus on half of the equation.
Yeah, he directs his first major critique at the spiritual realm. The author explicitly calls out the major world religions: Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, Taoism, Hinduism.
All the big ones.
All of them. He argues that these traditions, along with various spiritual cultivation groups in the East and West, suffer from a terminal flaw. They dedicate all their energy to the soul, but they completely ignore the difficult earthly work of building functional social operating mechanisms.
He argues that if a religious organization neglects the structural realities of society, their theological promises become irrelevant.
Totally irrelevant.
It doesn't matter if they are preaching about the return of Jesus or the reincarnation of Maitreya or any other divine intervention. If the plumbing is broken, the house will still flood.
He is particularly critical of groups that attempt to use fear or mysticism as a substitute for a mechanism.
Oh yeah, he does not hold back there.
Not at all.
Yeah.
He dismisses organizations that rely on sorcery, witchcraft, or threatening followers with impending catastrophes and the apocalypse. He views escaping into a dream state or living in constant fear as entirely useless.
It doesn't fix the pipes.
Right. It does nothing to alleviate the suffering of the world. And it fails to help the individual achieve any genuine spiritual clarity because they're actively ignoring the material reality they inhabit.
And having critiqued the spiritual institutions, he flips the lens and aims directly at political organizations.
The other half of the equation.
Exactly. He specifically calls out political parties, highlighting communist organizations guided by Marxism. He acknowledges that, unlike religious groups, these political entities are actually focused on the mechanism. They dedicate immense effort to analyzing resource distribution, economic structures, and societal plumbing.
Yet they fail equally hard on the other side of the symbiosis. The author asserts that these political frameworks completely ignore the greatest creator and the necessary construction of the human soul.
Okay, before we go further, the author uses a very specific term here, the greatest creator. Since we're looking at this impartially, what exactly does he mean by that?
That's a great question. Within the framework of Lifechanyuan, the greatest creator isn't necessarily framed as a localized deity demanding worship, as seen in some organized religions.
Okay.
Instead, it operates as the ultimate source of life, the overarching intelligence and order of the universe. It serves as the foundational philosophical anchor required to cultivate those beautiful souls.
Oh, I see.
And the author's critique is that because purely political organizations ignore this spiritual foundation, they lack the pure intention required to sustain their systems. No matter how meticulously they design the economy, without the anchor of the soul, their mechanisms inevitably devolve into new forms of friction, corruption, or authoritarianism.
It really is a devastating critique of how we divide our efforts.
Right.
I mean, he is painting a picture of humanity walking in circles. Half the world is praying for a harmonious society but refusing to pick up a hammer to build it.
Right.
And the other half is furiously hammering away at the structure but has entirely forgotten the purpose of the building.
That perfectly encapsulates the institutional deadlock he describes. Neither side can succeed without adopting the responsibilities of the other.
As we bring this deep dive into Shuifeng's philosophy to a close, I want to distill the ultimate takeaway for you. Despite the rigorous critiques of every major institution, the fundamental message of this text is surprisingly liberating.
It really is.
Because the ultimate conclusion is a total rejection of innate guilt. You are not born into sin.
It removes a historical weight that many philosophies demand we carry from birth.
He explicitly dismantles the concept of ancestral sin. The idea that you must bear the guilt or the spiritual debts of the people who existed before you is, in his view, a complete myth.
A total fabrication.
If your ancestors committed terrible acts, the consequences of those acts belong to them alone. The author states plainly, a king's children are not guaranteed to be kings, and a thief's children are not destined to be thieves. You enter the world as a clean slate.
However, that clean slate does not equate to a lack of accountability.
No, definitely not.
The text concludes with a definitive set of criteria for how our material logic is ultimately judged. We may not inherit sin, but our actions determine our alignment with totality. The author states that we are judged by whether we actively revere nature, whether we revere life itself, whether we revere the greatest creator, and whether we align our actions with that universal order.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's take all of these pieces, the absolute neutrality of our consciousness, the severe danger of poorly designed systems, and that final requirement to revere life and nature. Let's apply that directly to the reality you and I are sitting in today.
Okay, let's do it.
The author sounded the alarm when the global population hit 6.8 billion, warning that our current mechanisms were buckling under the pressure. We have now surged past 8 billion people.
Yeah, the numbers are just massive.
The physical resources of the earth are finite, and the living space is only getting more crowded. If human sin, our greed, our wars, our environmental destruction, and our daily interpersonal frictions is largely just the inevitable mechanical result of an overloaded operating system.
Much like those 6 exhausted roommates violently clashing over a single bathroom.
Exactly. Then what is our next move? As our global population continues to expand and the pressure on our structural plumbing reaches a critical mass, what entirely new, unprecedented social mechanisms will humanity be forced to invent, simply to ensure that our beautiful souls can survive the friction of the future?
It is arguably the most urgent design challenge in the history of our species.
It truly is. Well, a massive thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the mechanisms around you, and we will catch you next time.